So we have 9 inches, 9 inches on each side. Now we have to figure out, so how can we cut this up into equal parts? Well, we cut something up in equal parts. Remind students that that is division. So what do we have? We have 18 inches equals 150 years. So we're going to start here. What year? The Emancipation Proclamation. 1863. And then we have 2013. That's our 150 years. Let's use a little math to figure out what different points in here are. Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to remind students that we can write this as a ratio. Most 7th graders should have a good idea of what a ratio is in the early part of the year, and the 6th graders should have a better idea of that later on in the year. Or we can just write it as an equivalent fraction, as a fraction. So 18 inches, we're going to compare inches to years. Well, we know if 18 inches is 150 years, we got to find a number that we can divide equally into both of these numbers. Well, first thing you know is I can divide it by 2. So that means that 9 inches has to represent 75 years. So we know that if we go from here to here 9 inches, then this spot in the middle has to be 75 years from here. Okay? 18 inches is 150 years, so half of that must be 75 years. Well, then what year is the middle represent? Well, the middle must represent 1863 plus 75 years gives me 8, 13. This must represent 1938. So we got this end and this end, and we have the middle. What about in here? Let's use some more ratios. Let's go back to our beginning ratio. We're comparing inches to years. And we know that 18 inches is 150 years. Well, we already divided by 2. What else can we divide by? Well, we know that a common factor of 18 and 150 is 3. At least we should know that. 18 divided by 3 gives you 6 years. 150 divided by 3 gives you 50 years. So every 6 inches is 50 years. Because students should know that they divide both the numerator and denominator by the same number, then we have what's called an equivalent fraction. So if 18 inches is 50 years, then 18 inches is 150 years, then 6 inches must represent 50 years. So if I come from here to here, and I measure 6 inches, and if I come from here to here, and measure 6 inches, then I have another 50 years. So from here to here is 50 years, here to here is 50 years, here to here is 50 years. Well, what year would that be? Well, 1863 plus 50 years gives me 1913. So this year would be 1913. And 1913 plus 50 years gives me 1963. So now you see why I chose a measurement of 18 inches. You could have used 12, but numbers would have gotten too close. You could have used 24, but it would have gotten a little bit big. So 18 inches works pretty well with 2 sheets of paper. So now we have our dates: 1863, 1913, 1938, 1963, 2013. So from my introductory paragraph or selection, we have our 3 dates. You're going to ask students, well, what was special on this date? Emancipation Proclamation. What was special on this date? March on Washington for Jobs, Freedom and Jobs. And here is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. So now we're going to have the students cut out and place the events on these dates, and then we can start creating the entire timeline. But this portion right here is to help you get started on the mathematical portion. As you can see, we're adding whole numbers, and we dealt with how to use ratios. Okay, now that we've divided our number line or our timeline in some of the major time periods, we can go ahead and take some of these that we've cut out and we can put them on the number line. Now, when you start off, maybe you want the children to use pencils so they could erase. You may want to play with this first to see how you want to do it. You may want to do one in all white paper. It'll just be a sample. They can come back and put on color paper. Just depends on how clean you want your final product, how much materials you have, what you have to spend on materials, because color paper can get a little expensive. But that being said, we go to our Appendix A and we cut them out, and we know that 1863 was the Emancipation Proclamation. Now you may be using glue, you may be using tape, you may be using Elmer's glue, or you may be using the glue sticks. I'm just using this tape for demonstration purposes. All right. Now we have 13th Amendment. We're going to get to that in a second, because again, that was in 1865 per the reading. So we have to figure out how we're going to guesstimate where that goes. And then of course we have the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs, which from the reading they should know was in 1963. And then we have the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs. So the first project, if you will, is to make the number line. We read, we go back, and we're marking the different events. Now, again, we talked about ratios. We talked about comparing inches to years. 18 inches is 150 years. If I divide by the same number, numerator and denominator, I'll get an equivalent fraction. Every 6 inches is 50 years. What about the 13th Amendment of the Constitution? Well, that was ratified in 1865. We don't want to make this into a very detailed math problem. So what we can talk about is estimation. So then, rather than try to figure out exactly how much 2 years is, we can just say, well, about. But we can estimate about or approximate. About where would you put the 13th Amendment of the Constitution? Well, that's 1863. Then 1865 should just be a couple more inches over here. You can bring it up here. Again, you want to give the kids a little room, So you say maybe it's about right there. Now that becomes an integer issue because 1865 had to come after 1863, so it would be to the right of 1863. So then we would put 1865. Now be very careful because we're going to put a lot of other things down here. So we want to be careful with the placement. Again, I'll show you the final product so you can see, but I would recommend the kids start writing the dates in. Probably start doing everything with tape, write a lot of dates in pencil, because we have to make a lot of adjustments as we add a lot more information. So now we're talking about approximation. So we can approximate it would be here, but we know it has to come after 1863. So right now, off of the first reading, we know Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. 150 years later, the March on Washington. The 50th anniversary. 100 years later, the March on Washington, freedom and jobs. A few years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the Congress made it law, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And then we have our discussion questions about which we have to drive home. Why, after 100 years of the Emancipation Proclamation, quote unquote, freedom, after we were free, for 100 years, why would there have to be, or why would African Americans feel a necessity to march on Washington for freedom and jobs 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 98 years after the ratification of the 13th Amendment? That question we must continue to answer, continue to ask as we fill in these events here. Now our next reading selection is about convict leasing. And I don't want to go into any detail on the reading portion right now, but I want to talk really about, again, is how to set up the chart or the number line and the mathematical aspects of it. Now from the reading, I've stated that convict leasing occurred from 1865 to 1939. Now, that is just a time period that I use. There are some historical facts that show states had engaged in convict leasing prior to 1865, and that's a discussion you can have with students. But for the sake of the selection and sake of this lesson plan, I chose this period 1865 to 1939, when it was really in earnest immediately following the Civil War. So, not to have a discussion about convict leasing, you can do the reading on that and discuss that with the children. I want to go over mathematically how to approach it. So this, again, is whole number, addition, or subtraction, depending on how you want to approach it. So what I want to discuss right now is, well, how would you place it? How do you figure out how many years it is? And how we go about placing it visually on the number line. Because again, when this is all said and done, the student folds this up and they keep it. And it's always a visual reference, going back to answering that first question we had, the overriding question. Why in 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, with 300,000 African Americans march on Washington for freedom and jobs when we were supposedly free back here in 1863? So let's do some math.